Good evening. This is Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Corsicana, Texas. Hope everybody has been having a good day. Today is May the 14th, 2020. Tonight I wish to pay tribute to one of my favorite authors, a man who passed away exactly 20 years ago today in Durham, North Carolina. This is Dr. C. Eric Lincoln. At the time, for many years, he was professor at Duke University Divinity School. He was an educator, a sociologist, a pastor, an author. He was born on June the 23rd, 1924, in Athens, Alabama. His full name was Charles Eric Lincoln, but he always went by C. Eric Lincoln. Sadly, he was abandoned by both of his parents, but raised by his maternal grandparents, who apparently did a good job of raising him. He attended the Trinity School in Athens, an institution created by the New England-based Congregational Church to meet the secondary education needs of African Americans in that community. And while there, he picked cotton to earn money to purchase his books and pay $3 per year tuition for his studies. Growing up in the days of Jim Crow, there was not a whole lot of incentive for a young African American boy to graduate from high school, much less go into college and graduate school and pursue an academic career. But C. Eric Lincoln was an exceptional person. He didn't let things that people would normally hold him back. He pressed on and moved forward. He edited the Campus Chronicle, the Trinity School newspaper. He graduated the valedictorian of his class in the year 1939. After high school, he moved to Chicago to continue his studies, working during the day and taking night classes at the University of Chicago. In 1943, he entered the United States Navy and served until the end of World War II. In 1945, he moved to Memphis, Tennessee to enroll in Le Moyne College. He received a BA in philosophy and sociology from Le Moyne in 1947. In 1954, he received his master's degree in philosophy from Fisk University in Nashville and a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Chicago Divinity School 2 years later. And in 1957, he became an ordained minister. And he taught for a while at Clark University in Atlanta. And while he was at Clark, he had a student who submitted a term paper on a religion that he had joined known as the Nation of Islam. And that was Dr. Lincoln, who apparently was a lifelong Methodist. That was his first introduction to this religion, in which he became one of the leading experts on the subject. And in 1960, he received his PhD in sociology and social ethics from Boston University. And he had some difficulty convincing the dean that this was a subject worth pursuing. When he first mentioned the Nation of Islam, the dean said, "Who's that?" And he said that would be a waste of time. You ought to do your dissertation on the Methodist Church. But through some help of some influential people, the dean approved the topic. And in 1961, the first edition of the Black Muslims in America was published. I read this book in 1974 for a Black History class at Baylor when I was working on my MA in Church and State. It's my understanding that in January 1994, Dr. Lincoln came out with a revised edition of it. So, and no, I've never gotten a copy of that revised edition. 1994, even that's dated by now. But nevertheless, anything Dr. Cedric Lincoln wrote is worth reading. But this was the first scholarly research on the Nation of Islam. He was the one that coined the term Black Muslim. They were black, they were Muslims. There's a lot of different Islamic groups, and there's Muslims of various races and colors all over the world. And the term Black Muslims was never their official name. When he first started using the term, members of the movement resented it, but later they adopted it and wore the title with pride. Anytime someone writes a book or does any kind of study, as an outsider, it's going to be different than if they're writing from within. And again, Dr. Lincoln was a lifelong Methodist. He was at one time in the United Methodist Church. It's my understanding that in his later years, he eventually became a member of St. Joseph AME Church in Durham, North Carolina. But he never embraced the religion of Islam, but he wrote a lot about it. He knew a lot about it. At one time, I'd had correspondence with the late Roman Catholic author William J. Whalen, and I've read a number of his books. One of them is called The Latter-day Saints in the Modern Day World. And again, he identified his biases. He was a Roman Catholic layman who wrote on comparative religion for many years. And he said that he did not accept the teachings of the Mormon Church. And thus, he tried to be fair. You can certainly be fair as an outsider, but still it's coming across differently, the insider-outsider thing. He acknowledged that since he was a non-Mormon writing about Mormonism, his book would not be a book that a Mormon missionary would give to a prospective convert. And you can imagine that a non-Muslim writing about the Nation of Islam would face some opposition. He stated that Minister Jeremiah X of the Atlanta Temple at one time wanted to burn the books as fast as they came off the press. I corresponded with Dr. Lincoln, and in, I believe it was March of 1982, I actually had the pleasure of meeting him. And in fact, he autographed my copy of Black Muslims in America. Well, you can't, there's his signature right there. When I met him, he spoke in the chapel of Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. I've never attended SMU, but I have been on the campus to do research in the libraries and attend various programs, and that was one very good program. I later learned that when Dr. Lincoln came to Dallas, he was expecting to deliver an after-dinner type speech, but it was a chapel service, and they wanted him to preach, and he did a good job at that. But I asked him about Minister Jeremiah's wanting to burn the books, and his response was, yeah, he wanted to burn the books and me with them. But over the years, the Muslims began to appreciate him more. There were a number of Muslims present that night at SMU when he lectured. But this was the first scholarly research on the Nation of Islam. Following his publication, he spent the next decade at Portland State College in Oregon, Union Theological Seminary, and Fordham University, both in New York. And during the period, another book that he published that I have a copy of is called My Face is Black by C. Eric Lincoln. And then there's Sounds of the Struggle, subtitle Persons and Perspectives in Civil Rights. During the 1970s, I read all these books and used them as sources for my master's thesis, The Nation of Islam. And The Nation of Islam, Belief and Practice in Light of the American Constitutional Principle of Religious Liberty. And in 1970, he became the founding president of the Black Academy of Letters. 3 years later, he returned to Fisk as professor of religion and sociology and chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophical Studies. While at Fisk, he published The Black's Church Since Fraser. And I did have a copy of that. I think I loaned it to somebody. That happens a lot. But it's actually two books in one volume. The famous black sociologist E. Franklin Fraser did his study, it was in the late 50s and early 60s, called The Negro Church in America. And Fraser's conclusions are highly suspect, to say the least, and what he wrote is dated. And so you got The Negro Church in America, A. Franklin Fraser, and The Black Church Since Fraser by C. Eric Lincoln. He picks up where Fraser left off and hopefully corrects some of the statements that Fraser made that have been pretty much discredited over the years. And in 1976, he became a professor of religion and culture at Duke University, where he taught until his retirement in 1993. He was at first, Durham, North Carolina. When I first began my research on my wife's family tree, her maternal grandmother's maiden name being Durham, I immediately tried to place them in Durham, North Carolina. And I did a lot of research about Durham, North Carolina and Duke University, which was fascinating. Only problem is the evidence didn't show that they were there. They instead were in Fairfield County, South Carolina, and later DeSoto Parish, Louisiana. We'll talk about that some other time. But it was in 1984 that he published a book called Race, Religion, and the Continuing American Dilemma. And in 1990, he co-authored his last major scholarly work, The Black Church and the African American Experience, with his former student, Lawrence Mamia. The book was based on 10-year study and interviews with over 2,000 black ministers in the major religious denominations of the United States. I had a copy of that book, but I just don't know where it is right now. It's an excellent book. I have read it from cover to cover. I just wish I still had my copy. Lincoln also wrote fiction, including Avenue, Clayton City, which won the Lillian Smith Award for Best Southern Fiction in 1988. That's one of his books I have not read. Then he wrote poetry, The Road Since Freedom, collected poems. In 1996, he published Coming Through the Fire, Surviving Race and Place in America, a personal history that urged all people to embrace their shared humanity and work together for the greater good. He was a member of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, and while I'm not 100% sure, I have read that he was also a Prince Hall Mason. He was a good friend of the late Imam Warith Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad. And they one time had a joint interview at Emory University in Atlanta. And he told an interesting story about he had worked for a black newspaper in Atlanta during the 60s. And he was, well, this might have been the late 50s. Well, anyway, it was through this newspaper that he met Malcolm X for the first time. And even though they didn't see eye to eye on everything, they became very good friends. He arranged for Malcolm to speak at a number of schools, including some predominantly white schools, which no black Muslim had done before. And in 1965, Dr. Lincoln was doing what you call a fellowship at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And some of his colleagues asked him if he could arrange for Malcolm X to speak on campus. This was just like this was on a Thursday, they wanted Malcolm on Tuesday. He said, I'll try. Well, he called him. And he'd never seen Malcolm so sullen. This was in February of 1965. He said, Professor Lincoln, I would be glad to speak for you anywhere, anytime. But the problem is, by Tuesday, I might be dead. He said, if I'm still here on Tuesday, I'll be glad to, but I don't think I'm still going to be around. And he said he knew he was a marked man. He knew people had their orders. Dr. Lincoln was also a good friend of Alex Haley, the author of Roots, another one of my favorite authors. And Alex Haley's first bestseller was the autobiography of Malcolm X. Malcolm told Alex Haley his story. Alex wrote in first person. And when he concluded reading the manuscript, he made changes in it. And he said, let me read this over one more time, because I don't expect to be alive when the book comes out. He knew that everywhere he went, people were watching every move he made, waiting their chance to kill him. He knew they had their orders. And Dr. Lincoln said, well, why don't you report to the police? Malcolm's response to that was, they already know. In other words, he felt the police were in on it too. And on the afternoon of Sunday, February 21st of 1965, Dr. Lincoln was lecturing at a large Unitarian church in Boston. And somebody came up and handed him a note informing him that Malcolm X had been assassinated. His Eric Lincoln was respected by so many people who knew him, who read his writings, students he taught, people that he influenced, and to bring this great gift of scholarship to study the black religious experience. As I said, I first read the Black Muslims in America in 1974, 2 years earlier. I had read Alex Haley's autobiography of Malcolm X, and this began a lifetime of interest in this, among other movements. The black Muslims taught for many years that all white people were devils and all blacks were divine. They taught separation of the races under the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Well, he and Malcolm had a falling out, and he suspended Malcolm. May 21st, by the way, would have been Malcolm's 95th birthday, where he's still living, and I'll say more about that then. But Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca. He embraced Orthodox Islam. He rejected the black separatism taught by Elijah Muhammad, and he was eventually gunned down. And Sarah Lincoln knew him well. And the scholarship he brought to the subjects he covered is just tremendous. And interestingly enough, he passed away at the age of 75. He suffered from diabetes and other health problems. And he tried to make a difference as long as he could. It was on the very same day that he passed away, 20 years ago, May 14th, 2000, that the daughter of Malcolm X, Atala Shabazz, along with Minister Louis Farrakhan, were interviewed on TV. And Farrakhan, by the way, follows the original teachings of Elijah Muhammad. He rejected the Orthodox doctrines that Wallace D. Muhammad, now known as Warith D. Muhammad, he passed away in 2008. Farrakhan rejects the Orthodox Islamic teachings that the Imam introduced when he took over in 1975. And interestingly enough, the day of May 14th, it was on this day in 1976, and that's 44 years ago, in which I received my MA degree in Church State Studies from Baylor after having completed my thesis on the Nation of Islam. And like I say, it was 6 years later, 1982 was the only time that I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Sarah Lincoln. I did exchange a number of letters with him, and of course I've read quite a few of his books, but Sarah Lincoln left a tremendous legacy. He's gone, but not forgotten. Have a good evening.